Thank you everybody for your attention. Um, I've done this once in person, and I've done this once on Zoom. So this is the second time I did this in Zoom. Uh, you know, and there's always somebody who points to the spelling of color because of the American. So there's always smart people. So I'm using both interchangeably because in my professional life, we use both interchangeably. Just as a disclaimer, uh, the subject of color is really complex and broad. And this presentation is just as an introduction to, for discussion of this subject. The reason why is when people talk about color, I usually cringe. I usually bite my tongue because the first reaction is how low and how long, how low would I have to get to explain to this person about color? So there are many omissions to this subject area, and I'm just covering really the surface. So bear with me on that. The presentation, there's actually, two parts to the presentation. So I'm here. I could use visual examples to show you how some aspect of color are evaluated. And I'm trying to show you what are the scientific principles and explanation. So you as the viewer could adapt this knowledge and then use it for your own study in philately. So the two parts are, number one, trying to establish the basics. What are the scientific, what do we know about science? The science of color. How is it defined? How do we measure? How do we describe it? So the emphasis on this part is we're back to the basics. The second part is the practical part. After your understanding of the first part, let's try to use or show you specific use in philately. Then I recommend to you, there's a recommendation that once you know the basics, then you could use it for your own studies and interests. So on that, I'll start. So you asked, Sam, what credentials do you have when you talk about color? Since my graduation from my first degree, I was working at Tobacco and on Honor Avenue, and I'm the guy who makes the coloring for paint, plastics, and so on and so forth. So the company is what you call a tier two supplier to automotive. So we're not the ones who supply the automotive company the actual part, but whatever goes into the actual part, in this case, is the interior plastic. We supply the color concentrate. Then we were a representative of Color Corp of America, licensee in Canada. So if you go to a paint store now and you color match, they would go into this computer and they have a bank of 10 colorants. We're the people who make the colorants. The colorants are actually measured volumetrically by volume, not by weight, and is up to the accuracy is up to for every 1 mil, we split it up into 24 and even sometimes 48 divisions. So that is the color that we make. So I there's a course way back in 1982 called Color and Behavior of Color. I mean, besides a university degree, that is the highest you could get on a practical aspect. I then went to ICI Stahl permethane, and people know ICI Stahl permethane as the people who supply all the colorants that go into the leather. If you have leather seat in your car and it's made in the USA, we probably made that colorant. So this was in 1982. Only very, very few selected people. The only people I know who have this is actually Richard Gratton, who is the paper expert. So because he's in the industry, he has to know color. So, and this was one of the newsletter that featured me. This was way back in 1992 when I was so-called color consultant, ICI permit thing. So this was, I worked out of Peabody, Mass at that time for a year and a half. I was flying Monday morning to go to Boston and coming back Friday night and to do it. Did it for a year and a half, and I said, enough is enough. So what does this mean? All this, so I was involved in the transition. Color match before I was entering was like a black art. You have somebody who just, you have a technician that pours something into something, and then voila, they make a color out of it that matches something. So from color, judgment of color by eye to judgment of color by computers. The bigger issue is not just the measurement. It was the predictability that we could actually, with the right input, feed into the computer the colorants, and they would be able to spit out a formulation where you could match it. Now, in every hardware store, that computer is working. When you go there and want a color match, that's what they do. They go in and they will have a color match. And then on top of it, they'll suspend the colorant into the paint. But arguably, the most stringent business is the automotive industry because everything has to match. The textile on the car seat have to match the glove box, which is made in one plastic, and it has to match the dashboard, which is made in another plastic. If they don't match, you would not buy the car. The automotive company would be in big trouble. It was also the time where the digital computer, you remember digital computer, was $100,000 back then or more, and it was just going down to a an affordable, user-friendly price where people were able to use this. So coupled with the development of a censoring device, which is like what we call a spectrophotometer. A spectrophotometer, all it is it measures color. A light is shined on inside this, and a surface is put on, and then it reads. Now, coupled with all of this is that a very smart scientist was able to use an equation of light transmission in the atmosphere. So he was able to use this light transmission to put into this color computer, the spectrophotometer, and figure out the math, and voila, we have a color matching system. So I never use Hunter Lab, but it's similar to, all the animals are similar to it, where you bring it back and then you put a surface in there. In the back is a sphere, white sphere, 360 degree, and there would be light sources in there for measuring. That's a key thing in industry. If it doesn't work, it's useless. Color technology works. And that's why all the industry, the whole automotive industry, uses color computer and its nomenclature for acceptance of products. So part one, let's go to the basics. What do we know about color? How do we define it? How to read it, and so on and so forth. So what is color? Typically, you see the spectrum, right? Now, this is, if you put a prism under daylight, you would split this out. So just at, from red to yellow to green, everybody knows the spectrum. Just as a side, you think A is what you call as blue or B as a blue? What, in your opinion, is a blue? If I just say blue, what comes to your mind? Not important, but the actual answer is actually B, the skylight thing. This is a blue. I mean, for the longest time, I thought this was a blue, but in the definition of color, this is a blue. This is just as a sign. So now comes the most important part. This is what color is. Color is only an integration of three factors. What are the factors? Number one, observer, the person who looked at the eye. This is the eye. Number two is the surface. This might be a stamp, this might be a paint chip, this might be a tile. And number three, it is the light source. As a matter of fact, sometimes people say, without the light source, we don't have color. If you look at this, one thing that comes out of this is, without light, there's no color. You can't read color with light. And more importantly, it depends who is looking at it. I.e., if I look at a color and you look at a color, it might be different. So you're saying, Sam, you're full of blank. But, okay. But let's get back to that later on. Why do we assign names to color? So I'm using it for example, identification. And then to communicate, I'm talking to somebody on the other end and say, you know what, is that blue, the red or blue that I'm looking for? Do you think you could find that? Or for marketing, if you use a fancy name, as in some of the stamps, the prices just shoot up into the stratosphere. So those are several of the reasons. But to a color scientist, these names are useless. They're meaningless. A blue is a blue and green is green and red. But besides that, they mean very, very little to a color scientist. So how does a color scientist describe color? But before that, let's show you some properties of color, which you probably know anyway. So this is if we stir in a few pigments in there, red pigment and yellow pigment and blue pigment. Those are the so-called the primary colors. Now, this is if pigments and dye. This is what we call the subtractive properties of color. Contrast to that, if you mix three light sources, if you put a green light and put a blue light together, it becomes a light blue light. If you put all three light together, it actually becomes white. So this is the additive properties of color light. So basic color terminology, we use three axes of three different names to pinpoint color. The first one is hue or chroma. This is what most people call light, for example, the red, orange, yellow, green, and so on. That is what we call hue. The second axis that we use to measure is called saturation. We would go into more detail about saturation, especially in how saturation in printing of the stamp. The third one is value. This is one of the color chip. The hue, if you could imagine, well, okay, let's go to the next slide and then we'll come back. Saturation. More saturated, less saturated. When I did one of the presentation, the question was, why doesn't it go black? Because this axis is, we're going to see the color solid later. On one side is the brightest, strongest, purest red. And on the inside is nothing, where the saturation reduced to nothing. So, and it doesn't go to black unless this was much lower in the solid, a black or gray color, then it'll gradually go back, but again to white. Hue, we already mentioned that hue, is what most people call the color. For color scientists, one of the important nomenclature is the CIE definition of color, where there's three exits. Imagine, in the middle of a room, there's an exit that go from the brightest white to the darkest black. That's the lightness, darkness. And then on one side, you would have the A-axis from the brightest red. And then you gradually go down to the contrasting to the brightest green. This is the A-axis, LA. The B-axis is the brightest yellow, onward to neutral, and then onto blue. So this is the LAB definition. Now, all of a sudden, we could define color by using three numbers. So this is the CIE chromaticity diagram. This is not supposed to be two-dimensional. This is supposed to be a three-dimension animal. Imagine that you're in a room and this animal is standing in front of you. Again, the light dark axis. The axis is light dark, light and dark. And on this solid, this solid on the outside is the brightest of the red, the brightest of the orange, and so on. So this irregular shaped object is what we call the color solid. There's a lot of mathematics in there where the very bright scientist was able to use the color, which is the wavelength, and convert them to three numbers in this CIE or LAB nomenclature. So let's look at the observer, because I made a statement that it depends on who look at it. The way I look at it, the way you look at it, it could be a different color. And people are saying, wait a minute, how could that be? Let's look at the physiology of observing color. In your eyes, you don't have to be a specialist in biology, but even high school, we know that there is cones and there is rods. So those are how I would say a normal vision person have the cones that observe the blue color. They have the rods that observe the other color, and the green and the red. So there is sensitivity issues. In the normal person's eyes, those are present to observe those color wavelengths. Now, the type of color deficiencies. For those who have normal vision, you could now see the red, orange, yellow, green, and cyan or blue and purple. But for others, this is a deficiency where you cannot tell the red green. This one, you cannot tell the green. This one is somewhere in between. And I wouldn't even dare to pronounce all the names. When I was judging, I was advising one of the exhibitors to very prudently use color, because he uses red to highlight something, and then he uses green to highlight something, and then he uses blue to highlight something. Do you know what percent of men are colorblind? 1 in 7. With our 14 or 15 people here, we probably have 3 people who are colorblind, according to that. So observing color is dependent on, we actually have several philatelic judges that I know of are colorblind. You go on the web and it's easy, for those who have no problem, you could observe the 45 here, and then for those you observe the 8. But for colorblind individual, you might not be able to tell the difference from those. More so that vision is dependent on age. So studies have shown that the ability to see color declines with age. And the decline actually starts around 70 years old. So most of us who are on this, is our color vision may be declining. So we now talk about the other issue, the light source. If you measure sunlight, this is the wavelength that we could see the energy of the sunlight. So this is what a machine would try to duplicate sunlight. This is the curve from red, green, all the way to the narrow wavelength. Now, unfortunately, we cannot duplicate the sunlight. And we use this in CIE, we use this the temperature of a material. For example, if a material is heated to 5,000 degrees Kelvin, it would emit a white light that is similar, but not identical to the sunlight. D6500, this blue here, is probably, this dark blue here, is probably, as a light source that you could buy, it's the closest you could get to sunlight. Meanwhile, this aluminum C has been forever used as the standard light source. So we remember the wavelength of the sunlight as something like this. But look at this. This is an incandescent light bulb. Okay, people now don't have incandescent light bulb because we throw it away. But this is used to be the incandescent light bulb. Look at the difference in wavelength that it emits, the energy at different wavelength that emit, very different from sunlight. This is the fluorescent light bulb. Look at the peaks. The peaks is the tell-all to a fluorescent light bulb. Let's combine all this. And now we have this LED light bulb, which is this animal here. So going back, this is the energy release according to wavelength of sunlight. So all the light bulb that is available, daylight, incandescent, fluorescent, and LED, are but approximations of this. So we actually do not have very good, except the D6500, which is very different from the energy release of the light bulbs that you are seeing here. So now I ask you to put three things together: the light source, the surface that we are observing, and the observer. If you put these three things together, the light source, which is an energy curve, the surface that we are looking at, the stamp, which has special property when a light is shined on, and then our eyes. Our eyes are, as an observer, we have yet a different set of sensitivity. Put those together, then your brain interprets it as color. So your eye is what we call a very good integrator. It integrates the light source, it reads the surface, and we have usually one reaction that we read color. We read one color. Now it comes to a very different issue because everybody said the color is different. Is it? Now I want to introduce to you the concept of appearance. Question is, I'm showing you two stamps here. Is that a difference in ink saturation, or is it a color? So you look at this stamp over here, the green, this is what you call yellow-green, and this is too red here. So I would say something like this: you cannot tell if it's a color change or if it's a different ink, as this may be just a concentration or saturation issue. Let's take a look at our modern day printing technology. The modern day is so-called, CMYK color mode, which is the printing technology is all but a bunch of dots, a bunch of different color dots. So depending, for example, you go back to this red, depending on the intensity and the saturation of this could go from a pink to something like a bright red. And of course, all the color combination nowadays, you use the CMYK printing technology. We were at one of the Ottawa print shops where they print stamps. And they actually have, the one that we saw have 10 different stations, of which 8 of them, I think, are ink. And a couple of them are on the coating of fluorescent. So I'm not going to go into detail, but this is modern day where there you have a plate, the paper goes in, you have the ink, and then it get printed on the surface. So another thing on saturation, saturated, unsaturated. For some reason, there is a lot of misunderstanding on this concept of saturation. Okay, now comes a test. I'm going to show you 3 different color chips. Try to remember those. Try to remember the 3 chips that I'm going to show you. This is specimen A, sample A. This is sample B. Okay, I'll give you another crack at it. Sample A and sample B. Try to remember that. Now, this is sample C. 2 questions. How is sample A different from sample B? And then how is sample C different from sample A? Okay, I'll stop the test. I'll show you the answer. A and B are actually the same color. All I did was, when I exhibit, I use a gray matting. And I took the gray matting and I put a sheet of white on there, and then I put a black on there. This is going to illustrate a couple of principles. Now, C, some of my older exhibit, the gray actually changed color over 10 years. So I use that as an example. So C is an older one where it has yellow or faded. So this illustrates a couple of examples. You use your form 102, right? You bought the 102, you bought the stamp on 102, you bring it back and you put it into those black stock sheets. And you said, swear to God, I thought the color was different. No, it isn't. This is the concept of contrast. Our eyes get fooled when the chip, all those pair of colors are the same. They're the same. But if it is put into close proximity and you observe it, the appearance is different. Your eyes get fooled. Also, most people's color memory is very bad. People could not remember color. And we illustrate this already. It depends on how the color is presented to you, the stuff that is around the stamp. So in comparing color, it is very important that the orientations are the same. If you evaluate 2 stamps together, make sure they're in close proximity, make sure they're under the same light source, and they have the same, don't look at it one, horizontal and the other one vertical, because even that would change your observation for that. Then the problem of opacity of paper, as in many stamps. This is a white and black background. If I only show you this on the approval card, you would see it as a darker color. But on the Form 102, you would think it's a different color, and yet it is the same stamp. This is what we call appearance. Okay. This is an easy one. Take a look at both. Which is lighter, which is darker, left or right, which is the lighter one? Right is a lighter one. Guess what? What I did was I took an approval card, and on this, I put a doubt coat. A doubt coat is a transparent coating, and all it does is to doubt out the gloss. So the only difference, the color are identical. If you put those two into the color computer, they will give you the same reading. So why it is so different is because of gloss. Again, an appearance issue. Let's take a look at the graphics. If it is a very shiny or glossy surface, light shines in, and as much as possible, the same amount shines out. Imagine that's a mirror. You could easily see the complete projected image. But if the surface is rugged, and as this is the case, all it is, I put a doubt coat in there, which have transparent yet material that would change the gloss on this. All this is to tell you that even though your eye is a perfect integrator, there is many factors that would change your observation of evaluating color. Yet so many people say it's a color issue. It isn't. It's more than that. It's an appearance issue. Okay, now I'm going to introduce a big term, metamerism. It's actually a very simple term. So we have three chips here, A, B, and C. And this is under daylight, D or D6500. Roughly remember what the difference between A, B, and C is. Now I'm going to show you the three that is under incandescent. Take a look at the swing of the colors. Now I'm going to show you fluorescent. This is by far the closest match. It's the same three chips, but yet the light source is different. Now I'm going to show you LED. Yet the match for A and B is very close. Now just take all the A's together. So this is the spectral curve of all three, where this is a red, this is a red end, and the 700 is a red end. So A, B, and C, this is a brick red. They're similar, and they intersect each other at several points. So they're close, but they're not an identical match. So what does this issue brings up? Let's take a look at it again. This is chip A, daylight, incandescent, fluorescent, LED. Same chip in 4 different lights. So this is what we call the color consistency. So the color consistency of the same chip, again, depending on color, give you a different signal where you interpret as a different color. So we're recalling the different light sources, and if you and the free service A, B, and C chips. Summarizing this, if you in color matching, when you are matching a pair of chips or whatever, if you go to one light and it match, in another light it may not match, because that is not, you saw the three curves. You could see the ABC. They are actually not quite the same, but under different energy that is emitted to it, like you could see some of them are a good match at a certain light. So when you compare a pair of colors, it will swing depend on what the light source is. So now comes part 2. How are we going to use it in philately? You must have seen this, fan decks, right? You go to a Home Depot, and then you would say, I want to paint my wall, and they show you, there's tons of this. This is a fan deck, and then they would have tons of chips and so on. Now in philately, Gibbons have this for ages. I don't even know what the years are, but this is probably in the 1970s, where they try to have, color identification. But look at it, it's only 30 something chips, so very limited usage. With this little chip, they're trying to tell you all the color that was ever printed in stamps. It's not going to work. So then they have this another new chart. Now they created an animal and asked you to put the stamp on one side and the chip on one side. So this is using our principle of, if you want to do color matching, try to make it as close proximity as possible and try to have the same orientation as possible. So again, very limited use. Then later on, 79, 1986, they have this. So again, you put the stem in the hole and you try to match it. So we now have fan decks that are more elaborate. Michelle has the same thing too. This is one of the key books by White on color in philately. The green has it. A lot of places have this. It's actually pretty good, but sometimes it's too involved for the regular collector to be reading this because it is a big book. And in there are even more chips of how they define color. This is what they call their system to define color. And this is what the Philatelic Foundation uses. And you may have heard that Pantone is a universal color name where, from when you're matching paints to colors to textile, you would have this Pantone color paper deck that you could buy. And Methuen is another one where they have, again, this is all trying to, so why are using this an approximation only? Why is using this Fandex or chip to match a color is only an approximation? For an exact match, the reflectance curve of the pair must be as close as possible. You saw the three chips, A, B, and C. That is actually a blown up scale where we exaggerate one end of it. But in some cases, they are very close under certain light. But an exact match means the reflectance curve have to match. Why can we not achieve this? Because when you go back to what the paint or the color or the pigment that was used in the production of the stamp, it could be a pigment, it could be a dye, and there's batch to batch variation. So what is a pigment? A pigment usually means it doesn't dissolve in the medium. It is just in the physical shape is there still, where in a dye, it dissolves in the medium. It may be a solvent, it may be water, and so. So if you are not using the same pigment and dye that was used in the stamps on the chip, then you are only getting an approximation. So stamps are printed usually with dyes, pigment, paint chip, and so, whereas the paint chip is usually blended with pigment. So the paint chip that you pick up at the store now are usually made by pigment, yet the stamps may not be. We saw the metameric matches of the stamp versus a paint chip. We saw the ABC, the three chips and so on. So it may match in one light, but once you swing it into a different light, the match will disappear. And the other variation are due to printing process. Saturation right there. You know that there is dry painting, wet painting. Depending on even the moisture of the paper, but it's actually the same batch of dye. yet the resultant is very different. So I'm not an expert as Richard Judd, the top color expert in philately right now is Professor Richard Judd, where he used the VSC 6000 to do the analysis in much more detail. But for layman collector like us, when he present his paper like this, it is over everybody's head. A lot of us, even for me, I said, well, does it have to be that detailed? Because it missed the point. So I actually got to know one of the author, Fred Billmeyer Jr., because I was in the color business then, and I was talking to him. I was asking him for advice. This is one of his articles in APS in 1981 August. You could still get a copy of it in the library. So this is his way of presenting color. Now he is the major author, one of two author that uses this textbook that we use when we get our diploma on color. So he's the color guru, and by sheer coincidence, he's a collector. He's a philatelist. So we are able to speak the same language. There is a newer version now. This is only the second edition. So why do you need to identify a certain color? That's the motivation. Why do you want to tell a certain color? Because usually there is a variety that we are looking for that you saw the price in the catalog, and the price is a lot more expensive than the so-called garden variety. So we're looking for this very elusive shade. And sometimes for us, we want to use the color because it actually shows us what the printing or the period of use is. And some of us actually use this to identify whether it is a forgery, or sometimes it has been chemically treated to make it into a so-called changeling. Of course, all of us as collector, we want it all. We want to collect all the shades of it. So this is the one of the more expensive stamp, Parisian blue. I don't own one, so this is what I took off the internet. Of course, the regular version is a much less red, more like the sky blue versus this red. So this is a Parisian blue. And this is one of the US expensive, the pigeon blood red pink. So I'm not even sure which is which, but this is the elusive shade that is tens of thousands dollar more than the regular shade if you could identify. Now, this I know, this is the issue color. For one of the printing, for some reason, they couldn't match this grayish thing, and they create this animal called olive brister. This block here, probably 1.2, 1.5 million US dollars. This is a unique block. This stamp here, you'll probably buy it for 20 bucks. So big difference. And this is the weird stamp because I collect it, where it is not the front, but the back. You see this olive yellow thing. This olive yellow thing is what we call an olive back. This particular stem and the garden variety is probably 2,000 times difference in price. And of course, this is a unique animal. So we talk about marketing. Some very smart dealers came up with big names. Chinese love big names in collecting. Oh, this is the golden dragon variety. Take a look at the difference in color. All this was the basic stamp was issued, and then all of a sudden, it went from the Mandarin to cents. So in 1897, China's post office start Before 1897, it was actually the post office was just part of customs. So they were using the Chinese Mandarin, where all of a sudden it changed to. So all the stamps were bring back to print. So some of them, this was an original printing, of which there's 17 mint known. The mint one is probably $250,000. I don't own one. I only have a used copy. This example here is what the very smart dealer called an emerald lady, because there's only two mint copy known. And I'm just showing you this is a forged copy because the overprint is forged. I cannot even show you one of the two because I do not have access to the two mint copy. The difference in price, 20,000 times maybe. Another fancy name, Red Ruby. You see very little difference. Difference in price, maybe 5,000 times. So this is my recommendation. When you get to where you start to question, do I have the rare shades? My recommendation is you start your own library, because chances are, number one, you have the garden variety. You have several of the garden variety, and you know that they're different. But then all of a sudden, there's one that stands out. So start your own library, color library, because you are matching apples and apples. You're not using a paint chip. You're using the actual stamps. You're comparing the actual stamps. And again, the garden variety probably is not very expensive. And from this, try to do this exclusion exercise, you may be able to pin down if the one you're questioning is the color of that so-called elusive shade. And another thing that I collect is, just in case, this is supposed to be the same stamp in catalog, same stamp number in catalog. And yet one is pre-World War II and the other two are post-World War II. So it would help if you have a cover with that stamp, so you could prove that that shade was used at a certain time. So this is where you build up your own library and you build up your own proof. So of course you could go, as a Canadian stamp, go to Winnie Green and ask for a cert. Now, only if you trust the source. So thank you very much for your time.